very special panel discussion on socio-sonic hearing. I'm sure you're wondering what that's all about, but we're going to begin with Mershin and Pilo taking us through their creative ideas.
My name is Mershin Pillay, and this talk has been done in aid of the World Hearing Day 2022. And the title of the presentation is Socio Sonic Hearing Healthcare. We'll introduce all the people as we go through, but like I said, I'm Whd Pillay. I'm from South Africa, currently based in New Zealand, Massey University, and an audiologist and a speech therapist. So why sociosonic? What's this fancy term about, and why is it that we wanted to talk about this? Here's the main rationale for looking at this. Essentially, we wanting to challenge the dominant way in which hearing healthcare operates in the world. And in terms of looking at hearing healthcare, this framework is what we're hoping to use to help us think through this. Firstly, we wanting to look at what the reality or the value base of this dominant way of looking at hearing is. In other words, its ontological basis. And then we wanting to understand, well, what are the basic values or the truths that generate our practice, that generate our policies and the way we think about hearing healthcare, in other words, the epistemological basis. And then finally, we're wanting to look at the way in which we methodologically produce knowledge, how we do our research, how we engage our practices. And so the methodological features are what we're wanting to look at here. In other words, what's our science about? How do we do this then to develop hearing healthcare knowledge and practice? And so firstly, I think what's important is just to talk a little bit more around these terms. So if you look at the top column, the top row, you've got three predominant categories of three main paradigms that we might consider. The one that we're familiar with is the positivist or empirical paradigm, which may be called empirical analytical as well. Those are other terms for it. And really what it looks at is how we can take a whole big phenomenon like hearing and chop it up into bits, to elements that we can manipulate either in a laboratory setting or in a lab-like situation where we can then make information or the truth known about hearing accessible, available to us, analyzable, and then generalize it to the population that we wanting to understand. One of the key features, the ontological features of the science that we use is that we insist on objectivity. We say it's possible and it's something that is desirable. In fact, it's valued strongly within a positivistic empirical framework. Swap over to the second column, the middle one, looking at all those terms on the top. I'm not going to read them out to you, other than to say that within this so-called constructivist framework, that's the easiest term I'm going to reference. It refers to the fact that because there are as many people in the world as there are ideas, multiple truths, multiple realities are all what this paradigm admits into its knowledge, and says, when we think that your story of the world and my story of how I hear and my hearing experience are equally valid, and so these are multiple truths that need to be acknowledged. It also focuses strongly, it's what I would refer to often as has Band-Aid or plaster solutions, where you get a wound, you quickly put a plaster on this and the wound is healed, but you don't actually heal the cause of that wound. In other words, it's focused on practical. People who engage this often go, I'm practice-based, I want to do, tell me what to do, this is how I want, I'm an action person, don't tell me how to think about it, tell me what to do. Within this framework, subjectivity is celebrated. It is well acknowledged that that knowledge is not just inconstant, but we can only make knowledge through each other, that it's iterative, it's joint sense making. Go over to the last one, and this is the one I think most of us desiring to head to, but many of us are not there. And this is where we look at everything. All knowledge is contestable, right down to the most granular level of hearing. It is contestable because knowledge is always socially, politically, culturally, gendered, constructed in all of those different ways. And so it also looks at realities as being multiple, and mainly one of the core tools it engages is ideology critique. So I know this is a huge snapshot overview. We're going to come back to some of these ideas a bit later, but for right now, these are the key things, with the acknowledgement that mainly audiology or hearing healthcare in general is driven by a need to fulfill positivistic or empirical ideology. So in other words, you're a good hearing healthcare theorist, researcher, practitioner, if you can engage a positivistic science. And here's what we know through that domain. We know all of these, and these are the things we are expert in. We love anatomy, physiology, pathology. We know everything there is to know about how to assess, well, almost everything, how to assess and treat hearing pathologies. And that's where our expertise lies. But the question is whether that understanding is something we want to remain with. So in this slide here is an expansion of what we spoke about earlier on, where we're looking at the fact that an empirical or positivistic science is something that's really the major focus of what we do, which means we focus on the body. We've got a strong biomedical focus. It's minor focus, and granted this has been so in the last few decades, it is an incursion into understanding the ear and hearing within a social, cultural, economic dimensions or domains. So there are ways in which lived experiences, the social realities of, for example, hearing loss within, say, poorer communities or so-called majority world populations have been investigated, but it's not the main business of what we do. We still focus very much on the biomedical domain. These are other key things that we love to do well. So we're all about being able to explain and predict and do things through that kind of way of understanding ear and hearing. We constantly seeking causal effect relationships. We wanting to know how these things occur so that we can predict what's going to happen to treat it. We generalize usually the knowledge we get through, for example, in this, how we understand occupational hearing loss as an example. And then we value things like hypotheses verification. We set out to investigate the nature of a law and whether that's going to be as it is we plan, and then we go further into that. This is what really intrigues us. And throughout those domains, the ones that we spoke about earlier on, those three there, power distribution is what I'm asking us to think about when we're looking at how hearing healthcare researchers and practitioners do their business. When you're looking at an empirical, analytical, or positivistic framework, it's the practitioner or the researcher that's in charge. That person is the one who is, the buck stops there. In terms of the other frameworks, you can see that power is more equitably distributed within the hermeneutic or the constructivist paradigm, whereas within the critical paradigm, it seeks to analyze or uncover the nature of power and the relationships and what happens in terms of power and people with hearing impairments, etc. So what it does essentially is it focuses the lens on the ear, the empirical paradigm, and strips the whole person away from the ear. So we're looking at, if we had to focus the ear and the person together, if we had to really make this one unit of understanding, what would happen then? I'm going to ask Mpilo to talk about the rest of what we've got in this presentation, and I'll come back shortly.
Thank you. Thank you, Meshin. So basically what becomes interesting is what Meshin has already indicated, that there is this form of elimination of the human from the whole practice, that the human doesn't really find space, or whatever finds space is the biological and the organ itself. And we all know and we do understand that we are actually working with people who just happen to have ears, not actually ears that just happen to be on humans. So that's the whole idea of what sociosonic is, so that our solutions are more grounded on the people that are actually experiencing the condition. And then as we move along, then this actually of situation allows us as professionals to really unsee some of the messiness that really is inherent in terms of, if we were to think of, for example, a worker where I am a professional in an occupational space. So these issues like multiple exposures to different factors that could affect hearing, we tend to then look at what noise and maybe solvents, and we leave out all the other cultural or co-occurring sort of exposures outside the kind of work environment. So that basically becomes the main issue when we are discussing the sociosonic approach to hearing healthcare. So, for example, other like physical space and medications and all that, that's the whole mess that we find within the place where we practice. And if we think of our approach using the mainstream approach, it then finds some sort of a disjuncture in that kind of space. And it really challenges you to, or pushes you away if you are interested in actually understanding the space more than you are understanding just the organ itself. So I think I'll give over to Meshin at this point.
Okay, and what this slide is doing is saying that when we start looking at the chaos and we start looking at all of these multiple variables, these factors that we want to see, our science limits us because our science, the dominant science, engages the form of reductionism. As mentioned earlier, it takes a whole phenomenon and reduces it to little bits. It also uses essentialism. So we speak about the cochlear implant child, or we speak about the adult with the hearing loss, or we talk through all of these essentialist ways of defining and describing people and their hearing. And then the one that's critical, which we're really able at doing, we do very well, is that through a process of disrespecting, we dis-other people. So we take a whole complicated, complex person with good things and bad things and everything else, and we only throw them within a deficit framework through our specialist focus, through the biological reliance on the body as the way in which we can understand ear and hearing. So through all of these processes here, we create this, the person with the hearing loss, which may not be the kind of view or the lens that enables us to understand the bigger, wider world as we want to understand it. So whether our science matches real world factors is dubious. We don't think it does, okay? I'm going to hand over to Mpilo to talk a little bit more around this after I just introduced to you this broad framework. Myself and Warren and a few other people on this call were involved in developing what we refer to as the Socio Sonic program, essentially looking at street traders who were music traders in a busy market in Durban in South Africa. And these are the traditional things we looked at, and I'm not going to go into much detail other than point out to you that while this framework consists of classic components of hearing conservation, like the environmental noise and worker management, etc., we positioned this within the fact that this is a low middle income country, resource constraints, but specifically we looked at it within a decoloniality framework and the need to humanize workers, the need to take the person in this whole framework and position them flat center of what it is we were doing. And Mpilo will talk about this shortly.
Okay, so now we're looking at them at the worker themselves. For example, we then tend to, if you can move on machine, yes, yeah, we tend to then like machine indicated, we can tend to essentialize our approach just to be around what we are able or we think is manageable around the sound and the solvent. However, there are these other existing factors or existing issues that come with the worker into that workspace, and without looking at those or with by applying the science, we actively disregard all these complexes and chaos that is brought with by the worker. So in that way, we tend to then limit our activity or our practice within a very a narrow approach, and all the other chaos that links to how the worker actually the exposure, the concept and understanding of worker exposure becomes very much limited to what we think and we believe is essential for that context. So that's basically the issue that we want to elaborate here.
in terms of this summarizing slide helps us define a little bit around what we mean by sociosonic, and we're hoping to get more into the discussion shortly. But I'm going to leave this in your heads to think about as we talk through in our discussion shortly. So sociosonic being something that maps a multifaceted economy of sound, and that really that hearing healthcare should be understood as a decolonizing activity that essentially connects people by addressing boundaries of otherness. And I'm going to leave those words in your head as we enter the discussion shortly. But before we do that, I realize, Impilo, you didn't introduce yourself. Maybe just a line or two about where you're from, where you're at.
Okay, yes, I'm Pilo. I work as an audiologist lecturer at the University of Pretoria in South Africa.
And over to Harsha.
Mush and Impilo, that was an earful. So a lot to take in, I think, critical concepts. So maybe just to open up the discussion, I think what you're challenging us is with a changing practice, and maybe for everyone in the room to just talk about what that means from where you are. How are you shifting practices? What do you see as important? How are you humanizing, decolonizing, and perhaps engaging in a critical sense?
Can I go first?
Yes, carry on.
My name's Ravi Reddy, and I'm very happy to talk on this subject with my colleagues and the listeners. It was good listening to Mershan and Impilo talk about, I guess, deconstructing current systems and practices. I'd like to think of it as, for example, when you look at hearing healthcare access, and you look at the barriers, there are three barriers: structural, meaning how the models of hearing care is set up, resources, the capacity, delivery modes, and is it fit for purpose? The other thing to look at is the financial barriers. So can people actually afford to get to the service in the first place? And then secondly, once they're in, can they afford the services that are being provided? And then there's this long-term sustenance of services. And the final one I was thinking about, which I think is very important to this subject, is the cognitive side of things, where it will vary between context, geographical spaces, cultures, traditions, spirituality. So these things will affect, I guess, beliefs, attitudes, the knowledge base around should I get hearing care? Have my ancestors been using hearing services? I mean, personally, I'm from Fiji. We never had any audiologists out there. It was something like radiographers were thought to be people who repaired radios, and then because we used to know them as X-ray people, right? So I'm sure if audiologists were introduced back then, they would be something to do with the audio sound system. Jokes aside, but I'm just trying to give that example to put things into context where it will differ in areas, between cultures, between traditions, between languages. Similarly, if you flip this and put it in an occupational setting, I think those three structures again come to the fore. When you look at structures, the structural barriers, those would be around policies at the government level. Then you'll have the organizational level, the companies, how they run things. And I think my friends Warren and Pilo and David would agree that in occupational settings, noise, the extent of noise is wearing earmuffs or giving earplugs. But I guess in the context of it, it runs far deeper than that. When you look at financial costs, obviously, how much is it going to cost the organization? But then on the flip side, how much is it going to cost the worker in the long run? So a social cost, financial cost, and the people cost. And then finally, the cognition again comes in. So the attitudes of both the organization and the workers. And just to sum all of this up, my final, I think, argument here is that all of this can be framed into what Mershan said earlier around power distribution. So all of this financial structures, cognition, and access to either services or health promotion in occupational settings could be one, the political will, because if it's not there, it's not there. And we will continue to do things as we have done, expecting change, but without changes. And then you have the organizational control. Yes, we are invested into programs, but we'll invest into flyers, and that's about the extent of our health promotion. And we'll tell you what to do. We have done our training. And at the individual level, it is about choices, but also the lack of choices. So you can't say to employees that we give them hearing protection. Yes, you can give them a class 5 earmuffs, but they may need class 2 earmuffs. They might require earplugs. Some people are sensitive, but if you have this one size fits all, you're just ticking boxes. And that was leading on to my other statement about informed choices. So giving workers the, I guess, the respect that they can make those informed choices rather than shoving it down their throats that they need to do something that they're not invested in. And all of this, I think, finally leads into what we are talking about is equity. Equity in the sense of is everything that is supposed to be available, but also available in a timely manner. Those were my, I guess, rounded thoughts around it. David, Ale, and Warren Impilo might want to comment on it.
That was very well said, Ravi, by golly. And I was just thinking, in your last slide, Mission, you used the phrase economics of sound, I think. You put on that little phrase. How did that relate to what Ravi was just talking about? Because I think Ravi summarized my understanding of that really beautifully. Is that kind of where you were thinking, or did you go beyond that?
So I think that's the economy of sound, and yes, it could be both the economy as we understand it through financial or fiscal means, but also the political economy of sound. So noise has always been understood as noise, which is the sound of the other. And so in terms of looking at that, noise is quite a political concept. And in the specific example that we were talking about with street traders, we were looking at how workers who had no other means of generating income for themselves turn to their own, so they're self-employed, and engage working in contexts that were not necessarily healthy for them. So working in a roadside market, exposed to car fumes, listening to very loud music, and a whole range of other, what one would refer to, if this was in considered a formal work environment, would be seen as hazardous work conditions. And so sound interconnected with all of that then is something that is, and especially within an informal sector environment, is seen as something that states generally won't get involved with this in the same way as they would in a formal sector. So it's the economy of sound is specifically related to who and how the sound is generated, specifically within how populations like the ones we worked with in South Africa, Black African predominantly, were positioned and made powerless by the situation through a whole system, historical and other, that generated that. So it's that sort of thinking. I hope that isn't too complex, but I'm going to ask Warren to add to that a bit, because you've got a particularly interesting view. Thank you, Warren, on the law.
Thanks, Mershon. And Ravi just set me up very well there. For example, in the occupational context, occupational health and safety is regarded as, is taken for granted as one practice, one type of practice. And a big part of my current work is highlighting the fact that there are many types of occupational health and safeties, and there's a predominant type which I call corporate occupational health and safety, which is codified in our law and our policies and so forth. And then there's an alternate which I'm putting forward, which is rights-based occupational health and safety. So in terms of the epistemology and ontological aspects of it, the dominant form of occupational health and safety centers the deconstruction of the person and the devaluation of workers, their knowledge, their beings, and it empowers, the corporate hand even further in its control of working people as they are defined within the law. So occupational health and safety has this obvious ethical value, unchallenged. So there's this moralization of the employer as the reasonable man. The reasonable man does the good thing, and then the workers are the ones that are the weak link, do all the unhealthy, dangerous things, and they bizarrely hurt themselves and make themselves sick. So this is what I'm focusing on, is as a corporate occupational health and safety, and again, contrasting that to rights-based occupational health and safety, that for one says occupational health and safety is a service, and the workers are the client of the service, and also the workers' knowledge about themselves and their work environments and their living experience is central to the development of the service. Workers and the clients are co-creators of the service. And this is a very important thing for us to really shift to, is that we're providing services. We want to engage, to unserviced communities, but we must see them as co-creators of the service, or else we fall into an old culture of coming with something. And then we have to question whether we're really moving away, or whether are we so deep in the culture that we don't even actually see that we sort of just maybe coming with it in a slightly different form. So particularly from an occupational health and safety perspective, for me, seeing it as a service, seeing the knowledge of people must be centered, seeing the role, the democratic role of people in managing their lives, their working lives, their lived experience becomes central in this decolonization project, because people are not defined as empowered. Their human dignity is, like Ravi was saying, the right to informed consent. That relates to human dignity. And if we define people in our law as not having the right to choose different medical procedures or products that are put on or in their bodies, then we've got a serious blind spot. For me, that focusing on these things as services which are co-created between everybody involved tries to address that. Thanks, Marshall. Thanks, friends.
I wonder if Ali can maybe talk a little bit about, the idea of being human and what it means from an Indigenous perspective in healthcare and hearing healthcare.
Thanks, Asha. Yeah, I just want to say I completely agree with what Warren had just said. We really need to centralize Indigenous ways of knowing and our thoughts and our paradigms. And currently, it's not about rejecting all theory or Western knowledge, but it's really delinking Eurocentric thought and moving beyond Indigenous perspectives on Western paradigms and towards a space where Indigenous thoughts are within Indigenous paradigms. So yeah, I've been in the background clapping my hands to what everybody's been saying in this, because it's been a long time since we've been able to talk about this stuff and look into challenging the locus of power and control that's currently there, and how we can move beyond that. And so at the moment, for Māori here, from my own PhD research looking into experiences of hearing loss among our Indigenous elders here in New Zealand, they speak of wanting to be able to hear. They really like the hearing technology, but they're not getting follow-up services. They're not getting the maintenance of services, and they're not getting the services that their family needs as well. So it's very individual-centered care, and they're looking towards family, whānau-centered care. But at the moment, it's just that individual-based care that they're really getting, and they're not getting follow-ups either. So there are barriers there, and I think at the moment we're really looking in towards a needs-based approach. But for Indigenous peoples, we have documents there to claim that we have rights to these services. We have the rights to hearing health and ear health, but it's just not going that way at the moment. So yeah, at the moment there's a lot of otherness, disothering happening, and I don't speak for all Māori here. There's essentialism there. I can't provide a perspective for all Māori, but from those who I have spoken to, that there are, sorry, my partner's in the background, he's playing games. So you may hear him as well. Yeah, so just a lot of kōrero happening, which is speaking happening at the moment, that we all really need to have an understanding what hearing loss is, what tinnitus is, what services look like for Māori and other Indigenous peoples around the world.
Ali, just out of curiosity, how do the elderly Maori people engage with the idea of hearing loss? So is it through a pathology lens? Like, how do they, what understanding are you getting through your study, or is it still early days?
Yeah, it's not necessarily pathology based. I think a lot of the time they speak of not being able to hear their mokopuna, which is the youngest children and grandchildren, not being able to hear a lot of things that they used to be able to hear. So thinking about it from a broader perspective, not being able to hear the water or being able to navigate the world in the way that they used to, as opposed to a pathology based, oh, my ear's blocked, or for this specific reason, or it's more thinking about how's it impacting their life and quality of life.
Could I just take what you're saying there, Ale, and just talk about some research that we did, which showed that people don't even know that their ears really, they don't think about their ears. So you when you interview people about their experience of the sound world, they can talk about the emotions that sounds instill in them, and they can talk about the qualities of the sound. It was a beautiful sound or whatever, but they actually say that even though they know intellectually, they know that it goes through their ears, they don't think about their ears until you actually start making them and talking to them about it. It's fascinating. It's a real challenge for all hearing, I suppose, related healthcare, is to try and encourage people to realize that their ears are actually part of the process.
Yeah, as I speak to some of the Māori elders, they also speak about not being able to process things as well as they could be. So they're connecting all this pathological stuff, but that's usually the last thing that they're thinking of in the process. It's really interesting, David.
Warren, can I maybe get back to some of what you said, and Ravi as well? And I think we're all saying that, it's such a deeply entrenched system. So how do you shift a practice in this kind of system where, workers are devalued, dehumanized, and really think about how we can practice differently? And Peter, maybe you want to go first.
Yes, yeah. So one of the key things that when I was in the occupational health space in my previous life was to look at issues related to behavior change, issues related to worker empowerment, and issues related to workers' agency and participation within the processes of hearing conservation. However, the whole lens or I would say the structure still remained owned, and the driver of the structure still remained owned and situated or located within the corporate or the employer. So I thought that was the beginning to recognize the understanding, like what David says, that the social nature and the political nature of the sound. For example, in a space, in a context like South Africa, where migration or labor migration is a very real thing, and when you come to across people who are coming from different parts of the country, and now they have to have this uniform understanding of what noise is and why noise is dangerous for them, it becomes a really difficult concept, because now they have these other issues that they come with, and noise for them, or the idea that they can be in danger because of the work that they are doing, it's really something difficult or different for them to actually engage with. And now, when you then strip away the agency out of their own agency out of it, you then disempower them, and you allow even the little ability to positively engage with them you just remove it, and now it becomes part of the process, routine. And they just come into the clinic. When I would be sitting there, they would come into the clinic. It's just part of me. Press the button, and I just educate them about, and then they leave. And there's nothing about how that engages them beyond what they are doing, and to actually involve them in who they are. So that's where I think the shift could begin into understanding that who are you, where are you, what are you? You are here to work, yes, but this is this space is also part of who you are, and this is where you are also building your whatever who you are. Your being also exists within the space. Okay.
Before Warren responds, I wanted to just quickly add something to what Mpilo was saying. There's an ideology, it being so technologically focused, uses technology as the answer to treat the problem. And I think therein lies the biggest issue we have with here in healthcare in general, is that the man maketh the machine maketh the man. And I'm using that in exactly the same gendered reference as I wanted to come out in that way, because that's exactly how here in healthcare has been constructed. And so the challenge is can we deliver audiological hearing healthcare services without machines? What would we do without our audiometer, for example? And is hearing healthcare possible in other ways? So just to follow that up, because I really think the technological focus is distracting from the humanizing.
I also just want to add to that before we get back to Warren. For thinking about people and the agency and who the worker is, worker identity, against the backdrop of a long history of coloniality, the worker as non-being is almost the starting point. So in a way, we're assuming that the worker is a human being, and yet our history says the person hasn't been acknowledged as a human being. So I'm interested in, how do you take a rights-based approach when the human being in a way doesn't exist or is still coming into being, and kind of the historical challenge that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big challenge. Personally, I've been working with one of the large international labor federations, trying to shift their understanding of occupational health and safety to a rights, because they have internalized the corporate understanding with things like risk assessments. I'm sorry, guys, I'm a bit extreme, but I'm sort of anti-risk assessments as well, because again, it plays into the technology, the discourse of the corporate world. It brings in models of probabilities and stuff like that, which are financial models, that play to their strength. You're playing on their wicket, so to speak. So I've been working with the big international federation, trying to develop their understanding of a rights-based approach, so that when they are engaging with governments at the ILO or with industrial sectors signing agreements, they start bringing in this language of occupational health and safety as a service. And what the client says is always correct, apparently, in terms of the corporate world. What the client asks for is always correct. So we're saying that occupational health and safety is owned by workers. It's part of their remuneration fund. It's not a charity. They pay for their services by their labor. And when they don't receive their services, it's actually exploitation. There's no exploitation without poor occupational health and safety. It goes hand in glove. It's a characteristic of exploitative work environments, not just long work hours and poor wages. It's also unhealthy and unsafe work environments. So just personally, that's the angle I'm taking as one person sitting, in Durban, working with a big international federation to shift their thinking, so that when they're engaging with the employer, they're asking these different questions about the occupational health and safety practice in those companies, in those sectors. There's a whole other issue around legislation and the invisibility of workers. Even though one of the key institutions in occupational health and safety is the Health and Safety Committee, I don't know how, strong these committees actually are, how deep the actual democratic practice is. I can make assumptions based on my personal experience around that. So the discourse of occupational health and safety as a service, challenging the dominant for grantedness of occupational health and safety is what I'm really working on. That it's not automatically good just because it is the current dominant practice. So that's as far as I'm nibbling at it in my personal capacity.
So Ravi, how are you engaging that dominant practice and trying to shift?
Yeah, I have to agree with Warren that I think the initial question was, how do we kind of look forward and make changes and see how, in order for things to change? And in order for that to happen, Warren very aptly put that we need to challenge probably the status quo or the current practices. Not challenge in the sense of let's burn it down, but ask questions. Hey, can we do it some other way? Is there any other better way of doing things? I think when we use the word challenge, people think you're going to kill it. We're not going to kill it. We're trying to evaluate it. I was thinking of untangling the law and standards from occupational health and safety. I use the word untangling and not disconnecting. So when you start to challenge it, people think you're going to disconnect it. Well, the legislation is always going to be there, but currently the system is set up that the legislations are the gold standard. So we are constantly ticking check boxes. And then as I like the example. Say again? Harsha? I'll continue. And Warren, you said about risk assessment. That was a very good point. Now, David, myself, and a few other colleagues, we're currently thinking about a project where we're looking at this thing that you talked about, risk assessment. If it's done by employers, you're taking the power away from the workers. Why can't the workers also do a risk assessment based on their own understanding, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs of the hazards and risks in the workplace? And then you try to kind of balance them or look at them parallel with how organizations have set them up. But that doesn't happen. But if it happens, that would be, I guess, would give a more truer picture of risk in occupational settings, because that's where the workers are owning it. And that's where the noise factor would come in. So if the workers are thinking, well, we have noise, but it's not that high. And but if I do get hearing loss, the consequences are going to be moderate to severe. The employers might say, well, we have managed noise. The likelihood of hearing loss is going to be low. And in that low likelihood, if 1 out of 100 workers do get hearing loss, we can manage it. So it really comes down at the low end of the scale. But then if you have the workers at the moderate or severe end of the scale, there is something very wrong with the system. Yeah, those were my thoughts around. I think it's, again, I don't know, David, is there a better word instead of challenge? What is it? Discourse?
I don't know. I think you said it nicely. Disentangle. That's not a bad way to put it. Well, it's interesting because one of the things we notice is, quite often the workers themselves are quite resistant to things that are for their good, right? They don't like being pushed around by these health and safety people. And so what Ravi's talking about of trying to help the workers to take some more control of it, to assess the risks themselves, and to that sort of thing makes people engaged and not feel alienated by the system. That there's some guy with a clipboard comes around and tells me I have to wear earmuffs, but I don't want to. That's quite different from thinking about it yourself and then deciding, okay, well, maybe I'll wear, maybe I'll protect myself. Maybe I will do this. So I don't know if I answered your question really, Ravi, but I think I agree with what you and Warren have both been saying. It's important to get the people involved always.
I just want to quickly allude to this disentanglement you're speaking about, Ravi, at a broader scale. And specifically, I suppose, because this is World Hearing Day, looking at the relationship between the big financial organizations like the ILO, so the Labor Organization, World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. as what I think Richard Peet calls it, the unholy trinity, because of the way in which especially countries in the colonized or majority world sector, so people across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, etc., because of the way in which colonization is impacted on their economies, their lives, hearing, education, healthcare, and specifically what happens in the employment of the labor sector is very much influenced with trade-offs by these governments, by multinational companies, and so forth. And I think this big picture is very important to keep in mind, because when we're looking at World Health Organization and days like this, we see a silence of how those organizations are managed between policies to do with world, for example, World Hearing Day. Where's the discourse around that? Where's the bigger picture around how these organizations are really not working for the people they need to be working for?
Just a small addition. I tend to look at the law as a technology. And so it helps to devalue it, because we overvalue the law, in fact. So it becomes like, something from, it's sacred, So we need, I like to just make this discussion around the law as a technology. It's like applied mathematics, it's like physics, it's like all other forms of technology. And it actually carries a particular kind of dominant culture in the way it subjectivizes workers. It carries these assumptions about what people are and what they're capable of doing and all this kind of stuff. And of course, corporate occupational health and safety is a policing function and a discipline function. And it explains why workers actually don't like occupational health and safety officers. And when you discuss with them, it's an outcome of the corporate model, that is rules based and enforcement, driven, non-compliances and all this kind of stuff. And then of course, so shifting it to use indicators and measurement tools that focus on service delivery, on the participation of workers in the decision making, in the planning and the valuation, all of that. Then that's how I'm trying to suggest that we could challenge the dominant.
I couldn't agree more, Warren. I like to call it the criminality of occupational health and safety. So it's like, if you do happen to, by some way or another, not conform to any of the standards or the rules or the policies, there is a crime, because it is an act that has been contravened.
Robbie, do you know some sites actually have cages for workers? Do you know that some sites have cages?
I've read about that.
Yeah. They actually do.
Yeah, and I think we need to move away from that, eh?
It's interesting. It goes beyond. If you think about it, I mean, I completely agree with what you both say. It goes beyond just occupational health as well, right? There's in a sense, a kind of implied criminality in the whole of public health. If you, we're all sort of supposed to stay inside because of this COVID thing at the moment, and if you go outside, you've broken the rules. And in fact, if you don't seek treatment for some health problem that you've been diagnosed with, you get eyebrows raised at you, and people look at you funny, like you've done something wrong. So it's absolutely what you say, Warren, but I think it's probably even bigger. It's part of the whole system, isn't it?
Ali, maybe you want to just add in there from, an Indigenous perspective, how you see, the participation of people who have been marginalized in shaping a different system.
Yeah, I think often in Aotearoa, we often speak of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is our founding document. And within that, there are 3 articles. And so we speak of Tino Rangatiratanga, which is self-determination. There's governance, which is kawanatanga. And there's also orititanga, which is equity. So those are the 3 main things that we look at. And if we think about that, that's what Warren's been speaking about. That's a rights-based approach that key stakeholders and the government really need to set indicators and targets for, better for us to better meet the needs of Māori as well as Pacific peoples as well, who are marginalized here as well. And so I think if we provide a space that Māori can have to self-determine these processes, these laws, these policies, then we'll probably be able to provide a better hearing healthcare service. And that's what a lot of the elders are saying within my own research. Yeah, so it's not an easy one. It will take a long time, but it's somewhere where we need to start. And so, yeah, I think whakawhanaungatanga, we all need to build these relationships with our communities, not just with ourselves as researchers, as people within the practice, but we also need to work with our communities within this.
I think what has struck me is, you know, for the professions, almost the occupational health and safety and audiology, it's really taking a look at seriously questioning our dominant practice. Because if we don't know what that is, we're going to be part of the perpetuation of it. And in the name of good health care, in the name of improving services, etc., we're actually going to replicate that. And I think just listening to what was coming through here, it's saying, actually, please, let's look at ourselves first, and look at how those kind of fundamentals have to change. So how we work through building relationships as opposed to replacing with technologies, whichever technologies we're currently using. So I think, you know, for World Health Day, you know, the messages are very clear that there's large scale systemic change that we need, and that there's a collective that needs to work very hard with this. And it's really the undoing of ourselves in this process. But maybe as we end, to just get takeaway points from, you know, everything that we've heard and talked about today. Pilo.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the key things that I would like to take away is what you just mentioned, the look at ourselves in the way we practice to identify areas that are actually make us participate in the perpetual oppression of our communities and perpetual marginalization of our communities. For example, I mean, if we think of what David said about the public health approach to management of all different conditions, the issue has been, for example, for me, is that one of the important things that violence in our own communities is identified as one of the burdens of disease. However, our profession as audiology and speech therapy tends to sort of tiptoe around the idea of violence. And the question is it because it exists within the communities where the practitioners do not really have vested interest in? Because, I mean, violence in South Africa, for example, exists within communities that are marginalized or peri-urban and rural and all that. But mostly the practitioners in speech therapy and audiology are not living in those areas, so because they can't relate to that, so they don't really think of violence as a condition that needs to be addressed directly. You know, they want to look at the deficits or the outcomes of violence, and then that's where they actually come in.
David.
Well, I suppose I think, you know, trying to make people do things they don't want to do doesn't usually work very well. So trying to let people come to their own understanding of it, and thinking about the things that Warren said and Ale said about how if you let people have their own understanding, then they do what they want to do, and they'll, you know, if they understand the world in a good way, that is their way of understanding it, then they'll follow that path, and it'll make more sense to them, so they'll do the right thing for them, which is, I think, a better way than trying to force someone else's way of thinking on someone, which just makes them feel alienated and grumpy. And if they do whatever it is you want them to do, they do it unhappily, and they don't do it as soon as someone stops watching them.
Ellie.
Yeah, I think mine's very similar to Impilo. Just really understanding our positioning and understanding what that is, really reflecting and imagining our futures. And I think one thing that Linda Tui-Smith, who's an Indigenous scholar here in New Zealand, she says we need to have a confrontation with ourselves as and a confrontation with the colonizer, but also just thinking about my own sort of practices throughout my PhD research. I've had to look at my own positioning and what does that mean for me as a researcher, as an audiologist. You know, I've got insider and outsider boundaries. And so for me, it hasn't really been easy. And so to the community, who do they see me as? Do they see me as someone that's from here, outside, or someone that's inside that's able to speak to them about these things? So as we go forward with these things, who would be the best people to speak with our communities and bring this knowledge forward? So yeah, I think just stepping back, revisiting our history, what that looks like, centralizing Indigenous thoughts as we've all talked about, challenging the locus of power and control, as well as understanding what our positioning is within all of that. So that's kind of my takeaway. But yeah, thanks for today. It's been amazing.
Warren and Ravi, last words, takeaway messages.
If I just, for me, if democracy building is the biggest primary responsibility in all of our personal or professional, endeavors. If we are not measuring how we are building democracy, participative democracy, people's democracy, we are not building health, because people's health, they create their own health. And if we're not, developing a professional practice that facilitates that, then we are actually just medicalizing people, and we're not building health. We're not health workers, and we must stop using those labels for ourselves, because it's actually a little bit not honest. We have to build democracy. We can't undo the damage of the past, but we will change the futures. Whether the bean counters can measure it, that's another problem. But we have to have indices where we measure our democracy building in our practice. Thanks.
Thanks, Warren. Ravi.
Yeah, very good discussion. There are many things that I actually didn't think about, but was pretty much in line with some of my other left field kind of thinking. In terms of hearing, it goes back to, again, that power distribution. I was just thinking that I think we have constantly been saying that. I think now more so we need to act it out, that we need to listen to individuals and communities and not just hear them. Yes, that's my final point. Thanks.
Thanks, Ravi. And so, Marshan, I'll leave you with the final point and then to close the session.
The science we use is entirely wrong, I think, for the way we want to progress, especially to address the issues that say what Warren's raised and what Ali has just spoken about as well. And so everything from the fact that we use pure tones, why, to the kind of speech tests that we do when we're wanting to look at the effects of noise and people's listening, etc. There's so many problems with what we do that we traditionally have valued as the gold standard of a practice that needs to be really, really contested. So the challenges out there, I think when we look at another world hearing day come up, we want to be able to say we moved the way we address hearing healthcare in a meaningful way. And for me, that's through the science, by shifting the science. And we'd like to engage more people in talking critically around hearing healthcare. So feel free to email me and we'll give you information on how to connect with that SIG.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.